thank you for inviting me along this morning. This is a topic, I think, really topical, obviously, across the country, but across the globe as well, because we're really talking about preventable deaths here. And as we'll go through, a lot of the deaths that occurred during flooding are clearly preventable. And there's clearly additional things that we can be doing in terms of risk assessment and also treatments that could impact the death toll here and reduce it. So the good news is that despite we'll go through all the problems that we face in terms of flood risk here, a lot of this can actually be reduced through some targeted interventions, which are research-based, which is fantastic. I'll be touching throughout not only on research that the previous CRC did, but also on some of the research of others and how some of the research also excitingly that we did during our time working at the CRC, because I led a project with the CRC, particularly looking at the influence of road characteristics on flood fatalities and how that work is now being used globally and helping to validate the work that we did in Australia as well. So I'll jump into the slides now, and yes, some Q&A at the end would certainly be great. So for those that are unfamiliar with Natural Hazard Research Australia, we are all about generating impact through research. So we're all about building safe and more resilient and sustainable communities, and we aim to have our research which is useful, usable, and ultimately used. And so a big part of that is translating research to make sure that it is useful for decision makers, and that's a real target of today, is really translating some of this research to make sure that you know what the key findings are and can translate those into your own work context. So let's talk a little bit about the problem. And, you know, the image talks for itself. You know, we're really talking about mainly today people driving through floodwaters. We'll talk about some of the reasons why and some of the key risk factors and some of the potential interventions as well, and some areas for further research, perhaps just to whet your appetites about some of the ideas that could flow from some of the findings of the work as well. So when we look at natural hazard deaths across the country, currently those statistics say that flooding is the second most deadly form of natural hazard. And we know that people entering floodwater, either in vehicles or on foot or swimming, make up the vast majority of those deaths. So those deaths are not driven by people drowning in their homes, for example. You know, they are relatively rare circumstances. So circumstances such as Grantham, where homes were washed away, people drowning in their homes or as a consequence of leaving their homes in that area, are relatively rare, constrained to flash flood environments in the main. Also, another good example of those is Dungog in 2015, where 3 people lost their lives within their homes as well. So relatively rare, and you know, mostly we're seeing people deliberately entering floodwaters and then losing their lives as a consequence of those decisions. And as we'll also talk to, particularly when we're talking about vehicles, it's not only the drivers that are putting their lives at risk, but it's also the passengers. And that also accounts for a social dynamic of decision making, where we've got multiple people influencing the decision makers of drivers as well. It's somewhat of an entrenched social behaviour, which goes to the fact that community engagement alone is unlikely to really shift the dial in this space. When we have spoken to people about driving through floodwater, they talk about driving through floodwater on multiple occasions, that particularly in local environments where they think that they know the conditions or think that they have certain rules that can make driving through floodwater safe. For example, you know, some motorists will talk about how they get out and sort of walk through the water and then try and drive, or they'll assess the water in different ways to try and understand the velocity of the water as well, because it's, you know, what what these circumstances really are when somebody drives through floodwater is that they're driving into a very uncertain circumstance. They might think that it's certain, but it's not. So, the depth of floodwater can vary quite quickly as well, and the velocity can vary. The circumstances which they might have driven through floodwater before might be completely different at exactly the same location, only a few minutes to hours later. And so one of the key messages, particularly out of some of the research, is that only a small error of judgment when somebody's driving through floodwater can actually lead to a fatal outcome. And so when somebody goes, I know what my vehicle's, my vehicle can go through 1/2 metre of floodwater safely, well, perhaps that's not the best measure in the first place, but even if they're off by a few centimetres, that can be a deadly choice for them. Fatality trends certainly are fairly consistent throughout the research. So the findings I'll talk to you today do not vary significantly across different research undertaken here in Australia and globally. In fact, we're quite lucky in Australia that we've had a good number of researchers focus on this topic over the last decade. And so when we look at various different collectives doing research on the topic, Australia's certainly been leading the way. There's some great work out of Europe and Greece and the US as well in this place as well. The other thing, and it's not very well researched, is all the near misses. So this is where organisations like QFD and others across the country have a lot of data that could actually add to the evidence base in terms of analysing the rescues that occur. And one of the things that I'll talk about in the presentation is perhaps there's opportunities there that when significant incidents occur that where swiftwater rescue and other forms of rescue might be required to help occupants of vehicles, that actually there's some analysis done of the circumstances there, particularly of the road characteristics where those occurred and the flood characteristics, to get a better understanding and how that could then help inform road operators to better increase the safety of those locations. So let's look globally here, for instance. There's two good studies in Australia. There's the 2017 study that was done through the CRC. Also, Amy Peden, who's at University of New South Wales these days, Kyra Hamilton as well, who's at Griffith. They've done some great work on this topic. And so the piece there by Amy, slightly different, but the stats in Australia really show that about 50% of fatalities are a result of motorists in floodwater. Sometimes it's important to note that it may not be a deliberate decision of the motorist to drive into floodwater. And there's a couple of examples in Queensland of 2011 where one in Toowoomba in particular, where there's a car at a set of traffic lights and the flash flooding occurs rapidly at that intersection, and the water rises around the car and the car is swept away. So sometimes it is not necessarily a deliberate choice, and so that those circumstances also need to be noted as well. You can see in other parts of the world that the percentage is slightly less. They're around the 20% as well, but certainly in the US, it's quite similar to Australia in terms of the percentage, sort of 50%. And over. So you can see here it's a clear global issue, particularly in these Western countries that have done some research on the topic. So the good news is, and this relates broadly to climate disasters across the world, but though damages are going up, fatality rates are coming down. And there's a few reasons for that, particularly in Australia. But also around the world. One is the increased prevalence of early warning systems across Australia and the globe, which means that people can take action. And these stats, by the way, are for all flood deaths, not just those relating to vehicles. If you look at this graph, particularly after the 1950s, you started to see the organisation of emergency services directly to deal with flooding. So, the birth of the SES, for example, in New South Wales happened in 1955 after the Hunter Valley floods. The mainstreaming of floodplain risk management and flood mitigation really occurred after those same events in various areas of Australia as well. Like you had the big floods in the Murray, which also inspired Victoria in this space, probably Queensland somewhat later, but you certainly saw a step change in flood warning, flood management after the 1950s in Australia. And I think you can see in this graph longitudinally the impact that had. And yeah, at the same time, you had that growth in technology. You had transistor radios, and we've continued through there to be able to have better early warning systems. I suppose the advances today in those is that, a lot of the data collection is automated. We're not relying on manual readers of gauges ringing in, etc. So flood warning systems are a lot more effective today as well. So if you look at the age and gender of fatalities, and again, this is the total fatalities, not just those that are entering floodwater deliberately or driving through floodwater. You can see there that this Australian study, which looked at fatalities between 1900 and 2015, that the vast majority of those were in younger cohorts, particularly when we talk in a moment about those related directly to driving in floodwater, younger male cohorts there as well. So if we look at the more recent statistics, and this paper that was done through the CRC reflects the time, but the span of 15 years from 2000 to 2015. So there was 178 flood fatalities over that period of time. They were predominantly male, 67%. Again, younger ages, the highest proportion there between 10 and 19. Queensland leading the way, New South Wales and Victoria, reflective, in my view, largely of the flood risk in Australia. Like, Australia's flood risk is concentrated on its east coast. In terms of the intersection between flood and people, obviously there's flooding occurs in other areas, but just doesn't have the same degree of intersection between the flood hazard, people, and assets. Northern Territory, interesting enough, is the only jurisdiction in Australia where the death rates in relation to flooding are going up. So that's an interesting question in terms as to why that occurred. The stats there in terms of the number of people dying because of deliberate decisions is again consistent with what I said there at the outset, and that 50% of those fatalities, 50% of those 178 fatalities were in vehicles, and then 25% on foot, and then 12% swimming. And so, though today I'm going to focus mostly on those related to vehicles, there's certainly scope to better understand those fatalities occurring on foot and those occurring essentially by people playing in floodwater, which relates to the swimming aspects. So focusing now purely on driving through floodwater. So what does the research say in terms of those that are driving through floodwater? Like, who's most likely? So numerous studies show this. I'm drawing on a piece of work that I actually did for DFES back in 2017 here, which was one of the more comprehensive pieces that I was involved in. But I think that these four key groups are shown out in other pieces of work. I'll also refer to a bit of work that Mel Taylor led in the CRC, and I'll leave you with a link to that. And reading back through that briefly this morning, it certainly showed these same groups as highlighted in that work as well. So younger men, firstly, which is also obviously reflected in those death statistics that I've just shown you. Those that work outdoors, so they've obviously got more prevalence in terms of opportunities to come across floodwater. Drivers of four-wheel drive vehicles, so folks that perhaps have more confidence in their vehicles to be able to enter floodwater safely. And funnily enough, those that are confident in their swimming ability. So that was something that we specifically tested in the social research that was done for DFES to see whether or not there was a positive correlation between those that thought they were good swimmers and driving through floodwater as well. So the why people drive through floodwaters and why people avoid driving through floodwaters. And this, you can find this in a paper that I wrote with Kyra Hamilton and Amy Peden and Grantley Smith online, and mainly drawing on Amy and Kyra's work, which is really quite good because it really goes to the whole psychology of driving through floodwater, noting that Kyra is an excellent psychological researcher. But let's go through the issues of why. I'd have to say, through the time that I've spent researching this problem, they tend to be fairly eclectic, the reasons why. But here are, those that shown out most in the research. So successful past experience, which goes to the sense that, this is an entrenched behaviour. The situation perceived different from warning. So in this sense, perhaps it's not as bad as what people were making thought was being made out. So they thought it was safe to enter. The urgency to arrive at the destination. We talk about the dangers around the times of people going to go and pick up kids from school because they need to get there and pick up the kids and get home. Seeing other motors drive through, we'll go to some observational study that we've conducted previously as well that sort of highlights that there's a bit of a sheep mentality sometimes. People perceiving the hazard as not necessarily being significant, as in like a small amount of water to drive through. Some people drive through it to avoid becoming stranded. So they're fearing isolation and make the choice. Again, environmental conditions perceived not as being overly risky. The self-efficacy factors that they believe their driving ability in their car's ability to get through the water is sufficient. And then this aspect of pressure and encouragement from others, which is this social dynamic that's going on in the vehicle, where a passenger might say, go through, it looks safe to me, and off they go. Why are people not wanting to drive through floodwater? Not wanting to damage their car, not needing to be rescued or becoming stuck, so fearing the outcomes that might occur. Ensuring the safety itself of others. So again, that passenger dynamic, which is important, which is not overly well researched, by the way, that passenger dynamic. Often people focus on the decision of the driver themselves, but not the influences of those others in the car. Being a role model, not wanting to feel like an idiot, moral obligations to the safety of others, approval or pressure from others, experience, making plans and using existing plans, signage. We'll get to that when we talk about the road characteristics of floods as well. And environmental conditions perceived as perhaps riskier and an ill-equipped car. So they're all the reasons. There's probably many more reasons why people have elected why to or why not as well. Circumstances matter. So this is a really good one to maybe play in your own head. I'm not going to ask you the answers because I want you to say no in both circumstances. But in the study that's done here, as part of the focus group element, we asked community members a bunch of questions about 6 photos showing floodwater over roads. And we asked them to ask them essentially, what decisions would you make? Would you drive through this floodwater? And or if you said yes, why? And if you said no, why not? So in essence, if you have a look at the bottom slide, ask yourself whether or not you drive through that. And if you went to the top slide, ask yourself if you drive through that. And essentially, the key conclusion of asking these questions was that everybody that we spoke to, more or less, realised that there were dangers in driving through floodwater. But most people found circumstances where they thought that driving through floodwater was safe. And so it may not be surprising that, particularly that bottom image, that some people thought that it was safe to drive through that bottom image. And some of the reasons why they named that was, hey, I can see the edges of the road. I can see the edging markings. I can actually see the lines in the middle of the road there too. So I'm thinking it's not overly deep, and it looks not very fast flowing either. So again, this is floodwater. These are the conditions that we'd say, turn around, don't drown, don't enter floodwater. But people are finding circumstances where they believe that entering floodwater would be safe. And you've probably been reading that quote that's on this slide as well whilst I've been talking. And essentially this quote, I think, very much dictates those circumstances. So this resident, in summary, is basically saying, I drove through floodwaters, and these were the reasons why, I thought it was safe to do so. But if these reasons didn't exist, I probably wouldn't have done it. So circumstances do matter, and not all floodwater is the same. So briefly exploring some of the hazard conditions in which people were happy to drive through floodwater. So here we're seeing a high percentage of people that essentially were happy to drive through floodwater as long as it was about a half a metre or less deep, which is a little bit scary when you think particularly about sedans that the research basically showing that anything more than 15, 20 centimetres really starting to perhaps even in still water make the vehicle unstable. And for four drives up, we're around about the half a metre mark as well. And, folks, it's only a small percentage, but those that are driving through water that they believe that was greater than a metre, that's pretty scary. So that goes again to the whole issue about perception of hazard. And then flow conditions, right? So again, this is a relatively large sample. People thinking that they're actually driving and the water's not still, that there's a slight or moderate flow with the majority of people entering. And again, scary that some people are actually saying that they thought the flow was rapid. Obviously, this is their perceptions of the speed at which the water was flowing, and it's they also, there's some bias there in terms of their memory, because this study's happening a little while after the flooding occurred, about 6 months after the flooding occurred in WA, but just really interesting in terms of, again, the perception of the hazard. And then the feeling of danger. So when people are entering those conditions, how are they feeling? So most, insignificant, low or medium is the majority here. Only a few are feeling as though that there's a high degree of anxiety about driving into these conditions that they actually drove into. And then passengers. So I was seeing a bit of a variation in the results here. So some passengers having little to no concern, whilst others really being concerned or very concerned, but yet the driver is still entering water. And so switching gears a little bit to a different study, this is an observational study. So this is actually watching people drive through floodwater. This was a bit opportune. This was a piece of work that I led. It was during some flooding in the Shoalhaven in 2015. We just happened to come across this opportune road where the road was closed, but people were still driving through floodwater. The floodwater was not deep or raging. As you can see there on the plate on the right side, that was what the floodwater looked like. It was really interesting to sit by the side of the road and observe and record the types and the nature of behaviour that was occurring around this circumstance. So what we saw is that road closed sign there, 84% of motorists just drove straight past it. Most of them were four-wheel drives and most of them were males. One of the really interesting things was police vehicles, for example. You'd hope that a police vehicle would sit by the edge of the road and book all these motorists that were driving through the road closed sign. But police vehicles were actually entering the water, just highway patrol sedans and continuing to drive through. Also saw on the odd occasion this sheep behaviour, where a car would basically stop before the water, perhaps turn around, and if that occurred, another vehicle would turn around behind it. But often, if a vehicle was in front and kept going, the vehicle behind would obviously follow as well. And yeah, you can read all about that study in the reference there provided. So one of the things that I spoke to Jay about on the phone was, this interest in understanding hotspots, right? Where you could identify that circumstances were going to evolve that were more dangerous than perhaps other locations, such that you could identify those in plans and perhaps be talking to road operators about, making these sites safer, or local councils, for example, and making sure that signage was installed or other things there as well. There's some good research, and I've provided a reference at the back to some work that the UNSW Water Research Laboratory also did in testing real vehicles, led by Grantley Smith at the end of the presentation. But essentially, these are what we call the flood hazard guidelines. They're published by the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience in some of the core doctrine around floodplain management in Australia. And what these hazard guidelines are really showing is the relationship between depth and velocity. And what I really want to highlight here is the H1 and H2 classes. So essentially what this is saying is that Anything about 20 centimeters to a foot in steady state water with zero velocity really is being regarded as being the maximum degree that vehicles could enter floodwater. And in this case, regarding it as safe, noting that my belief would be it's very hard to, in reality, say that anything is safe because you never really know what's under the floodwater. Even if you thought it was shallow, it could be washed out beneath. But in terms of planning, when you're looking at flood studies, etc., and looking at flood hazards that has been determined by flood hazards in your planning, these are useful guidelines to be looking at, because essentially when determining risk, the first stage of that really should be to understand the frequency of which flood hazard conditions occur. So if you're seeing conditions of really H2 and above occurring on a frequent basis, well, that site really should be a priority in terms of looking at how they could be better managed into the future. And even things like allocating resources to closed roads, that those sort of locations are picked up first. So that's first and foremost, really think about flood hazard. The other component, that's really getting into the research that we led around the influence of road characteristics on flood fatalities, is then to look at, well, what are the characteristics of these sites? So if you identify a site where there's a high frequency of high hazard conditions, what are the characteristics of the roads that are there? And so this study that I'm going to talk to you about, and then some of the global aspects that follow from that, the subject we really want to talk to now. So what we have here on this slide, this is a real location where a flood fatality occurred, and you can actually see this is just some news footage. This is the vehicle where the unfortunate circumstances occurred. And from the media reporting on this one, the vehicle essentially lost the edge of the road and then came off the road. There's no guardrails, there's no curb and guttering, etc. And unfortunately just drove into the floodwater off the side of the road, and then the vehicle rapidly submerged. And this was one of a number of sites also where emergency services were readily there. So there was a Rural Fire Service vehicle very close by in this circumstance. There's another site in our study where an SES rescue truck was literally 200 metres away, and it sort of goes to this whole notion of deep floodwater. And when you have these circumstances where vehicles are entering deep hazardous floodwater, just how quickly those vehicles can be submerged, and just the dynamic circumstances and how dangerous it is once a vehicle leaves the road. So one of the things in terms of thinking about how to reduce the deaths of people driving through floodwater is to say, well, how can we actually reduce the incidence of vehicles being swept or otherwise leaving the roadway during floods? And particularly at this site, you can see what we might have been looking at in the study, well, what we were looking at in the study. So one of the key factors at this one in particular at Maitland was actually the depth of the floodwater. So when you see the height of the road versus the surrounding landscape, you can see that the height of the road is probably at least 2.5 metres higher than the surrounding landscape. So you can get an understanding that as the water was across the road, just how deep the water was on the edges of the road. So these were the results and the factors that were analysed. And you can see on the map on the side, a fair number of these sites were in southeast Queensland. Fair number of these sites related to flooding either from 2011 and into those floods that were quite deadly in around 2015, 16 as well in southeast Queensland and in New South Wales. Also picked up a couple of sites in Victoria and Western Australia. So I'll go through each one of these factors and just briefly talk through the results. So the first factor here is upstream stream length. So looking at basically the catchment sizes of which these events are occurring. And so you can see there that the majority are occurring in smaller catchments. Only really a few really occurred at the very bottom of very large catchments. That one, for example, I just showed that occurred in Maitland in 2015 did occur down towards the bottom of the Hunter Valley, but most of them are occurring in smaller catchment conditions. One which I think is really important, which goes to that whole point about how do you stop vehicles leaving the roadway, is this side barrier. So there were 0 side barriers, so guardrails in place at the 21 sites that were investigated. Flood signage is another one. So in this case, 12 of the 20 sites that were investigated for that particular characteristic had flood signage. So that's a double-edged sword. So that shows that perhaps not all of them obviously did, but that even though flood signage was there, flood signage was perhaps not effective. So one of the key questions there is, well, how do you make flood signage more effective? And some of the research that is particularly relevant is some of the research around railway crossings, for example, which is a similar sort of problem when you think about it. And so that research really says that the more dynamic you can make the signage, and obviously can also combine those with gates, the more effective reducing the number of people crossing railway crossings. Deep water adjacent to roadways, so the majority of sites had deep water. So again, this is the whole thing about getting swept off the road. So if you're going into shallow water, greater chance of being saved rather than if you're going directly into deep water. Downstream vegetation or obstacles. So this is interesting. So we know of locations where people have been swept away and been able to get out of their vehicle, cling to trees, etc. But what we're also seeing here too is that sometimes from our analysis that downstream obstacles can actually work the opposite way. So there's a case in Seymour, for example, where the vehicle leaves the road and it hits a large rock, and rather than being swept further downstream, it rapidly sinks once it hits that large rock in the stream. And so they can act both ways. So we wouldn't necessarily say factor that downstream vegetation or obstacles into a risk assessment process because it is somewhat uncertain, but it's worthwhile noting that it probably has some influence. Road speed, so it's about 50-50 here. So in terms of what we're really looking for there was, were they driving at a really fast speed and therefore sort of miss all the environmental cues and drive straight into floodwater? So about 50% of roads were above 80 kilometres per hour. Roadside markers, so being able to mark the edges of the road, 12 of the 21 sites had those in place. Lighting. So this was a smaller number of observations, but this also plays out in the international literature where a number of these deaths are occurring at night and in poorly lit areas. So that would be reflective of this analysis as well, but noting that there's a relatively small sample there as well. Bend in the road before entry point. So 5 of the 20 sites that were investigated for that characteristic had that there. Dipping road grade. So this is where your road grade goes down into the causeway or the floodway steady. So you might enter floodwater originally that you think is shallow, but it gets gradually deeper. So in this case, 11 of the sites out of the 21 had that characteristic. This turnaround with ease is really interesting. So, in the US, they had the campaign Turn Around, Don't Drown. And this assumption of, even in the flood it, forget it tag, this assumption that people can actually turn around, I think is really interesting. And what you'll see from some research in Greece and this particular point here in Australia is that sometimes that is not the case. In fact, there's a case study there from 2011 where a vehicle is driving down a highway. And so it's a 2-lane road and it's another 2-lane road of oncoming traffic on the other side. So the vehicle with a large number of cars behind it was not able to turn around at all. It would turn around back into oncoming traffic. So it had the choice of basically just stopping there and being the first vehicle in the large queue of vehicles to come across the floodwater and be the first one to stop and hold everybody up, or enter the floodwater, and what happened there was a fatal circumstance. 6 out of the 20 sites there we assessed as not being able to turn around with ease. Noting too that different vehicle types need different turning circles, etc. as well. Curb and guttering, again, what else is there in the road environment that might reduce the opportunity for cars and other vehicles not to leave the road? So only 5 sites had curb and guttering out of 20. Also reflects that a number of these sites are happening in rural and remote locations as well. Low traffic volume, so again, that's reflective of that same point. So 14 of the 21 sites we assessed as having low traffic volumes. And then the road sealed, so 18 of the 21 sites had sealed roads there as well. But what's been quite cool of late is that there's a really great scholar in Greece that's been doing a lot of work around flood safety in Europe, and they've picked up our work and applied it in Greece. And it's really interesting that, of course, the world, it doesn't really matter. The same sort of things have come out. So 94% of these sites that they analysed in Greece had no permanent flood danger signage. 16% had roadside barriers. So again, you've got that absence. We didn't find any. They found 16%. But the key message being that where fatalities are occurring, these things tend to be in the minority. 21% had curb and guttering. So again, that's pretty consistent with what we found. 50% occurred on secondary/local roads. And I think that's really what our results are showing, that they're occurring more on local and more remote roads as well. And similar to that point that I was just talking about, 74% had occurred at sites where there would be difficulty in turning around. One study which happened before our work in Sweden, which looked at flood fatalities in part, also found that guardrails were not in place at the vast majority of sites where these things had happened. So one of the key things that I think comes out of the analysis of this whole piece of work is where you have the absence of road characteristics which stop vehicles from coming off the road, there is a higher danger. It's logical, and I think the evidence supports that as well. But one thing that does need to be kept in mind, particularly when you're thinking about further interventions, that if you do put these sort of piece of infrastructure in these high-risk flood locations, they're also likely to get damaged. So you're actually likely to increase your damages because they're getting struck by debris and other things and might actually need to be replaced after events. So by trying to save more lives, you are likely to increase the costs of the infrastructure damage at these locations as well. So reflections and observations, really, this is about what can be done. And so key message really here is though these campaigns are useful, and I would not suggest in any way of not having campaigns that really raise the awareness of the issue, they need to be supported by other things to be effective. So the regulatory space is really important. So people being fined for driving through floodwater, there's a successful manslaughter case in Queensland, for example. They're all good things to be promoting to try and reduce the number of people entering floodwater. Behavioural, that obviously goes to the whole campaigns, but also goes to the better understanding of some of these psychological drivers, focusing on passengers as well as advocates potentially for safety within vehicles. Structural and road design, so I've spoken a bit about that, but just have a look at that image in the middle there of the vehicle that's in quite hazardous circumstances there. You'd suspect that that's relatively, shallow but fast moving floodwater, but the guardrail is really preventing that vehicle from moving. One thing in speaking to swiftwater rescue operators as well is in high risk areas, if you were to work with the road operator, whether or not, if the guardrails were to be installed, whether or not there's other features that could actually be engineered into those that made swiftwater rescue both safer and easier to effect. And so that's an interesting thing to think about there as well. The other one is information. So making sure that information is widely available so that people can be encouraged to plan their journeys effectively. Sometimes this information in different parts of the country is not all in the one place. It might be on a local council website versus a state government website, for example. The other thing is signage. So as I said, dynamic signage is much better than passive signage. And you know that in Southeast Queensland, there's been a lot of investment in road signage, road cameras, all that sort of stuff, which I think is all really positive. Vehicle design is another one. So, a bit of be ahead of ready thinking here as well. How is the nature of vehicles changing? We're going to be looking at autonomous vehicles in the future as well. So the intersections between greater knowledge about the flood hazard and different routes and vehicles being routed around that in an autonomous way potentially has a great opportunity to reduce the frequency of people's entering floodwater. And then emergency response as well. But noting too that just further investment in an emergency response is not necessarily going to reduce the incidence of people entering floodwater or perhaps even reduce the fatalities, because what we know is that some of these folks have unfortunately passed away in locations which have been very, very close to first responders. And the other one is that if they're not very close to the first responders, in some instances they're quite isolated from them, and emergency response is not necessarily going to get there in time for them. So to whet your appetite too in terms of some thinking for future research, I think this nature of this risk assessment methodology, which takes the research and helps to apply it, such that road operators, emergency services can highlight areas that are going to be of higher risk that they need to focus on. I think that's something, the establishment and trial and the improvement of that certainly be something to think about, and certainly seen that interest in other places. So I know of at least one local council area in Queensland at the moment that is actually trying to do that at present. Design of roadside barriers in flood-prone areas is also an important thing. So noting that the issue there is these things are going to get damaged, right? So there is some reluctance by road engineers to put them in place, noting that they then have an issue about the road structure and needing to increase damages in the future. The effectiveness of community behavioural change campaigns is important. Further validation of the research that I've just gone through, particularly in terms of road characteristics, noting that still relatively small samples, and so being able to take that research and expand that, particularly the fatalities that have occurred since 2017 in Australia, would be useful, I think, to further validate that and see that same research design being taken up by others internationally to further understand the influences on an international scale. And the analysis of flood rescues, which I think is a really low-hanging opportunity, even in-house for emergency services. Because another key component of that risk assessment at a very basic level can be, okay, well, where have our 000 calls or 132-500 calls been for flood rescue in the last 10 years? And are there any sites there that have actually come up more than once? And particularly, as I said there before, where you have sites that you're doing rescues in particularly dangerous circumstances, and they might be classified as near misses, going back and really analysing, well, what are the unique circumstances that have occurred at this point? So investigating that. And I think also for emergency services, see how they can connect with the road safety governance aspects as well. So, local road safety committees to try and drive this as an issue locally, and see how road operators can then implement suggestions to improve the safety of roads in these locations as well. Obviously, we've spoken about more things, assuming that the nature of the roads stay the same. Road operators might just wish to build bridges and other forms of structures in place rather than maintain the classic causeway structures in place there as well. But more discussions between emergency managers and road operators is really important. And so just some further reading and a couple of webinars. So make sure you check out the work there, the community experiences of the 2022 floods, and we've got a webinar there online with Mel Taylor. But that also covers some of the attitudes of people entering floodwater, etc. there as well. And there's a summary report of that. There's also the work on flood risk communication that the Bushfire Natural CRC did. Mel Taylor led that, so that's another good source. There's some work there from Risk Frontiers that goes through flood fatalities over the last decade, including the 2022 floods. And that paper there by Grantley Smith, really looking at the testing of full-scale vehicles rather than modelled vehicles as well, is quite interesting. So, yeah, thank you.